The Trump administration has announced that it's freezing $2.2 billion worth of federal funding to Harvard. Harvard's president responding and saying that the school will not sacrifice academic freedom by complying with the administration's orders. Now, the president is also suggesting taxing Harvard as a political entity. And joining us now to break this all down are Alyse Adamson, former federal prosecutor and host of the At Least You Heard It Here podcast, and Hans von Spakovsky, senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Alyse, Hans, thank you both so much for being here today. Alyse, I want to start off with this latest news about Trump suggesting taxing the school as a political entity. What kind of legal grounds does the administration have here to do that?
That's a great question. So first, it's important to note that the president cannot unilaterally revoke a tax exemption. So the school is operating under a tax exemption through the IRS through a 501c3. In order for a tax exemption to be changed, and here I think the threat is changing their status to a political entity, that needs to be done within the IRS. And there is a process, due process here, where there must be specific legal findings made that the institution is no longer operating as a nonprofit. And there have to be clear legal violations, such as some kind of discriminatory conduct or also impermissible partisan politics. And that is a relatively high bar because there's been no evidence presented yet that Harvard has engaged in any of those things. So it would be an uphill battle, and it would not be through executive order. It would have to be through process of the IRS.
Hans, I want to give you a moment to respond to this latest development as well.
Well, Alyse is correct. I mean, this is all defined by the statutes on 501c3s and the activities and IRS regulations on what you can and can't do. An educational institution like Harvard is not supposed to and is not allowed to engage in partisan political activity. That's the kind of thing that can make you lose your status. I mean, the president's talking about this, but really the main issue right now is the fact that Harvard is refusing to comply with Department of Education demands that they do something about the anti-Semitism that has infested the university. And that is something the administration can get into because they enforce federal civil rights laws. Jewish students have a right under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to be able to peacefully enjoy their right to an education. And I'm just stunned that Harvard is refusing to do anything about that.
Alyse, your response to that?
Yeah, I think everybody agrees that something must be done about anti-Semitism on college campuses or anywhere, really. It is a serious issue. And I think most people can agree, at least we both can agree, that what we saw on college campuses earlier, I guess late last year, should not have been allowed. That being said, I think the directives to Harvard far exceed that stated purpose. Because if you look, they're not just requesting or requiring, rather, that Harvard do something about anti-Semitic protests or even viewpoints, but they're going further. They want to audit departments, even student viewpoints. And it's broader than just anti-Semitic activity. What it is an attempt at censorship in an academic institution. And I would just note that if this were a Democrat administration and through the guise of a very legitimate purpose, that being eradicating anti-Semitism on college campuses, then demanded that they essentially stop teaching anything that does not align with their political ideology, I think everybody on the right would be up in arms. It's just simply government overreach.
Hans, to Alyse's point, Harvard has said it is committed to fighting anti-Semitism, but it just won't relinquish what it calls its right to academic freedom in relation to those other requirements that Alyse noted there. Do you think that this should be a satisfactory response for the Trump administration, considering the school is a private entity?
Well, I don't think that's really a correct assessment. What the administration is saying is that the discriminatory policies, I mean, it's not just anti-Semitism, but there are discriminatory policies inside and out of Harvard that violate federal civil rights laws, including, by the way, in the hiring. And there's all kinds of evidence that Harvard, for example, has been hiring based on race. And what's particularly, I guess, stunning about this is that Harvard has a shameful history, for example, of discriminating against Jewish students, something that started more than 100 years ago, that the school didn't even acknowledge or admit or apologize for until late in the 80s and early 90s. And what the administration is saying is that the kind of discriminatory policies that predominate throughout the university, if you want to keep getting federal funding, you're going to have to stop that. And again, under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, if you are getting federal funding, you cannot discriminate in violation of federal civil rights laws. And Harvard, unfortunately, now has a long history of doing that.
Alyse, I want to go deeper into this issue of funding because Harvard has a huge endowment, right? Reportedly $53 billion in just the last year alone. That's the largest of any U.S. university. So, there's some people saying, why does it matter if the federal funding gets cut? Why can't Harvard just take money out of that $53 billion and fill in those gaps there? But Alyse, is this really that simple and straightforward of a solution here?
Yeah, it's not. So first, I would argue that just on principle, which is why Harvard is litigating the funding issue. There's two issues here. There's the federal freeze, and then there is the threats to change the tax exemption status. With respect to the federal funding freeze, some arm of Harvard has already initiated litigation to challenge that. And even though Harvard does have money, they should not have their funding frozen or revoked again just because of ideological viewpoints that are expressed on the campus. And again, I agree with the other panelists that if it does go into discriminatory territory, that's one thing, but those need to be actual findings that are made. That's number one. Number two, it's not that simple because what Harvard can do with their endowment money is sometimes limited. And I don't have the whole list of restrictions in front of me, but it's not like a giant pot of money that Harvard can just use at its discretion in any way. So I think the simple answer is Harvard does have money, which is why they have decided to initiate this litigation and fight this fight, while other institutions, because mind you, Harvard is just one of many during this pressure campaign of censorship that have been threatened with this federal funding freeze. They're just the first to really fight back, but understand that they can't just use $53 billion however they so choose.
Hans, a main concern here in terms of this funding freeze is the impact it's going to have on research. What is Harvard going to have to do here to try and fill those gaps?
I just disagree, I'm sorry, with what Alyse is saying. They have the largest endowment in the country. They were found guilty of racial discrimination in a case by the U.S. Supreme Court. They have not done a lot to prevent that discrimination from continuing. And in fact, throughout that entire litigation, they did everything they could to hide what they were doing and to continue that. So this is about discriminatory policies, not ideology. And the idea that Harvard would be hurt by not having $2 billion to charge over $60,000 a year just in tuition to their students, that they can't afford this. The average middle-class person across the country whose kids don't go to Harvard are sitting there wondering, why are my taxpayer funds going to the best funded, one of the most elite colleges in the country? And I think that's why most people are going to support what the president is doing here.
Conservative investors. What does the name Reagan mean to you? Reagan was the ultimate conservative. We at the Reagan Gold Group consider ourselves the ultimate conservative gold company. Do you as a conservative investor see the storm clouds of chaos and uncertainty approaching? We do. The stock market hates uncertainty, and there is lots of chaos on the horizon. High inflation, unsustainable debt, and political tensions are rattling the markets and creating volatility. Does Does your portfolio have an anchor in this storm? You have car insurance, homeowners insurance, and life insurance. But what about your retirement savings, your 401k? We urge all fellow conservative investors to learn about the one asset that could help keep your nest egg from cracking under all this economic pressure: gold. Call the Reagan Gold Group right now to get your free wealth protection kit and ask us how to get up to $15,000 in bonus coins.
Alyse, Hans brings up some of the concerns we have been hearing from some Americans. How do you respond to or read that?
Well, Hans brought up a
Well,
lot
on,
with respect to discriminatory practices. If we're talking about the affirmative action ruling that came down, I mean, that was applicable to how all institutions were assessing their admissions. I mean, to just say this is just Harvard, I think could be a bit misleading. Now, with respect to Harvard being a moneyed institution, some call it elitist, $60,000 in tuition, inaccessible to the average American. I think those are all very strong points, and I think they're all true, which is why people are very suspicious of that institution. But I think that is a completely different issue as to whether or not it is proper to freeze federal funding. Those federal funds do go into research, which then has impacts to the entire country, breakthrough research, health research that can help the average American. These are folks that are extremely intelligent. It is the best and the brightest do go to Harvard. So, I think there are a lot of different issues. There's the social issues, which we're not wrong. It is inaccessible. But then there are the legal issues, which is this proper? Can they do that? And so can Harvard make up the difference? And again, I think with their endowment, my understanding is there are some restrictions in what they can do with their money, not to say they don't have money, which again is why they're able to fight this rather than acquiesce.
Hans, building off of everything we're talking about here, is there any other option left for the administration to use to sway Harvard at this point?
Well, I think they should consider the federal funding that goes to all of the Ivy League universities. They are doing that. Alyse herself just admitted that all of these universities were discriminating in their college admissions. Harvard had been doing that for a very long time. In fact, like I said, more than 100 years ago, they started doing that against Jewish students. So having the Department of Education and the Trump administration look at these universities to make sure this has all been rooted out, not just in their admissions, but in their hiring too, I think is a very important task for the administration. And it's something that the prior administration refused to do. In fact, Joe Biden gave a speech telling universities to ignore the Supreme Court's decision in the litigation and decision against Harvard and the University of North Carolina. This administration is stepping up to try to make sure that that kind of decision does not occur.
Okay, I want to take a look at some of the other universities that are also being hit with these funding freezes. Alyse, we've seen other universities, mostly they've been trying to appease the administration. We saw Columbia increasing campus security, disciplining students. University of Michigan stopped its DEI programming. Do you see Harvard's stance potentially starting to influence other institutions not to follow the administration's demands?
I think that's a very complicated question, and there's a lot that goes into that analysis that every institution really needs to examine on a case-by-case basis. And I say that because not all institutions are situated the same. As we keep discussing, Harvard has a very large endowment. Harvard has a lot of legal firepower that can help them litigate this. Now, right now, it appears the Trump administration is targeting mostly elite universities that have the highest endowment, but that is not to say that they all can take the hit. I think it will certainly embolden some other universities to stand up now that they know that one university is challenging it. They may jump on the same legal theories in the pushback. I think that their campuses might demand that they take a stronger stance. So I think we can expect to see more pushback, but I also think it's going to depend on what are those demands. I said at the top of the segment, the issue here is the demands exceeded the stated purpose. If there's legitimate requirements, I think some universities would gladly adopt them. And I think that was Harvard's position. And I just want to say, I think personally, have higher education institutions gone a little too far and not accepted viewpoint diversity? I actually think that is an issue, but that's an ideological issue. There's nothing illegal about it from my perspective. And I think a lot of universities are now re-examining their discourse on these college campuses and deciding, hey, maybe we did go too far to the left. Maybe we should invite more diversity of view. So if that's all it is, then, maybe they would follow what President Trump wants. But again, my issue is that President Trump is exceeding that stated point and has moving into unconstitutional territory.
All right, Hans, your closing statements here. There's a dissent we're seeing from quite a few universities about these cuts. We've already got Cornell, MIT, Brown, that's just to name a few. How far do you see any potential legal action going in courts?
Well, if they keep pushing this and other universities join in, it may get to the Supreme Court. But keep in mind, this was $2.2 billion. Harvard was getting $9 billion. So the administration didn't even move to revoke all of the money that they were getting. And yeah, it's private universities. They can have ideology if they want to, but they have no constitutional right to federal funding. If they want to have a university that only allows one point of view, fine, they can do that. But that doesn't mean that they still have a right to get federal funds. That's a privilege, not a right. And like I said, I think most Americans across the country are sitting there again thinking, why am I going to Harvard University? My kids aren't going there. My kids aren't going to go there. And they have such a huge endowment. There's no reason for my taxpayer funds to be going to that university. And I think that's the reaction you'll see across the country.
All right, well, I'm sure more is going to come out of this, and it's going to touch a lot of students out there. Alyse Adamson, Hans von Spakovsky, thank you both so much for being on here with us today.
Everybody wants cheap airfare, but where do you find it? You call low-cost airlines. They specialize in cheap flights, discount hotel rooms, cheap car rental rates, and with a best price guarantee. If you want the lowest prices on your airline tickets or other travel services, call now. That's right, call. That's the only way to get these rates. Experts are standing by 24/7 to get you the cheapest airfare and hotel rates available. So don't wait. Call now.